thanks to Gail that we're here together, and many, many thanks, Walter. Thanks to for the introduction, for the opening. Thanks for coming. So I'm very happy to welcome you to another Language and Education Symposium, the number 3 in the series. We're still in the Senate room. What's changed is we moved from the old Senate room to the new Senate room. Now let me see, is the volume okay? Because I have a clip on mine. So the first two were held in the old Senate room, we're now in the new Senate room. And in principle, the view is very nice. I think they've pasted some huge lettering. How they did it, I sort of feel dizzy thinking about what they got to the outside. Okay? But every once in a while you can turn around and you can enjoy the inspirational views. In a sense, this is a commission talk. So Gail said to me, the following would be useful if you talk about it. So I'll do my best, but it's also kind of a warm-up band for the day. So I think as we move along, we'll have a very exciting day, a great program. And this is a very good venue for milling around also during coffee breaks and so on. Now, the notion of registerial maps is to look at different educational contexts and ask the question, what are the text types, the registers, the genres that are relevant to these contexts, and how do we reason about them fairly holistically, fairly globally? And that's where we need a registerial map. And these maps can guide us for various purposes in education. They can guide us, for example, in selecting material for a particular subject, putting together a textbook, analyzing, understanding a textbook in terms of the challenges, exploring the output by students in both speaking and writing, developing a curriculum, a sort of staged curriculum that is in some sense a traversal of registers on the map and so on. So I'll show this further, but this will be one representation of the map that we work with. And a number of you will be familiar with it, but I'll come back to it after having said a few things about our context here. Okay. But so that's a map of different registers, different text type based on context. But let me say something about the sort of neighborhood in which we operate here at PolyU in thinking about language and education. So there are a number of activities within the PolySystemic research group with very permeable, fluid boundaries. I just want to point out that while we're concerned with education linguistics today, and there's quite a large group, that's in an environment where we also have discussions of student functional theory and description more generally. We have multilingual studies, we have multisemiotic studies, we have sort of focused institutional linguistics, like workplaces, the work by Gail, Jane Lockwood and others on call center discourse, healthcare communication, and particularly specific topics like research into language and space. So all this is an environment where we're exploring, in which we're exploring education linguistics. One area that's very important to education linguistics is multisemiotic studies. And here is a person sort of leading this activity in our group, Francis Lowe, giving a talk, part of an intensive course at the Catholic University of Sao Paulo a couple of months ago. So it's something that gets around the world. We have many international connections, and we have our fantastic Pearl River Delta course. Education linguistic research, a number of different strands in this, including looking at curricula, looking at texting curricula, looking at different subjects, trying to characterize different subjects in terms of the context and the text that make up these subjects, looking at student writing, and so on and so forth. Also including, in fact, looking at translator training as part of education. Now, so these are a few vignettes from the previous one. So it was about a year and a half ago. It was on the 21st of January last year in the older centrum. And we had, again, a very, very interesting, very stimulating program. And a lot of activities came out of this. And this is what we're looking forward to today. Also, new initiatives, new ideas, new connections coming out of the day. Like today, last time, the central person was Gail Forey. She was the one who organized this and stood behind us and led us and guided us and so on. So many things Gail for. I guess after a year you've forgotten how much work it was. So. But you have a wonderful team, and I'm very, very grateful to this wonderful team. There are lots of possible topics for symposia of this kind. So, for example, we could talk about learning language, learning through language, learning about language, in Michael Halliday's well-known formulation. I think a number of us are very much interested in pushing longitudinal studies of mother tongue, of course, but then also second foreign language. And this is an area of research that's attracting more and more interest, in particular building on the findings from mother tongue longitudinal studies and taking the second foreign language longitudinal studies, supplementing the cross-sectional studies that have been very dominant for a long time. The whole notion of development of a personal registerial repertoires. So how do we expand our meaning potential? Well, we do it by adding registers as we travel through life. Notion multilingual meaning potentials. I mean, what does it mean to learn another language? What does it mean in terms of building up a meaning potential, splicing a new language into the existing meaning potential? Very exciting for us now, of course, this huge educational experiment, the transition in Hong Kong from secondary to tertiary education, essentially moving a year from secondary to tertiary, and the opportunities for studying this, but then also, of course, for intervening and making the process smoother and trying to reform it in different ways. And the connectivity between secondary schools and tertiary institutions, very, very important. Something that a number of colleagues are concerned with, we're very much concerned with, flexible delivery, supplementing the material educational environment with virtual educational environments like virtual classrooms. The connection between assessment and curriculum development, so that these are not in separate silos, but they're very much strongly connected and mutually informative of one another. The notion of autonomous learners, we've had this for quite a long time. One of our colleagues, Nick Sampson, has illuminated the notion of autonomous teachers. So these are complementary notions of autonomy. And so if you think traditionally move from the teacher-centered to learner-centered view of education, in a sense moving to a relationship-centered with modeling and mentoring as a central theme. The ecology of textbooks, the evolution and design of textbooks, very important. What will happen now that new tools are available for delivering textbooks in electronic form, sort of breaking out of the covers of the book in some sense. And the semiotic complementarities in education. Spoken and written language, often forgotten but very central. English and Chinese, they're in context, that complementarity. Complementarity in language and the semiotic systems. So there is no shortage of topics, and if we can trust Gail to continue with the energy, the series will continue. Yes. So topics galore, right? No shortage of topics. But today I will, as I said, focus on registerial maps. And so what's the notion of a registerial map? Well, a map is a clear concept. You have some territory. Nowadays people are started talking about geocartography. Why? Well, because it's becoming increasingly possible to produce maps, not only of Mother Gaia, of our planet, but also of other heavenly bodies. So geocartography is specifically to emphasize that we're talking about our planet. But registerial maps, maps of this kind, are simply of a different kind of territory. So not of a material territory, but of a territory made out of meaning, a semiotic territory. And many of you will come across the map that I will work with today. Now, as with map making, when we're dealing with physical territory, it's important to remember that there are different projections. There are different ways of looking at the territory. And I will use one projection that is based on the question of what's going on in the context where we're trying to map out the text, the registers. So the question of field, the activity of the social semiotic process. But there are complementary maps, considerations of what's the relationship among those involved in the context, the interactants, tenor, what's the role of language and other semiotic systems in the context, and social activity, social behavior, mode, and so on. So this is just one map. Let me build it up step by step. You may have seen it before, but just step by step. And first, you sort of see 8 primary types of activity. So the suggestion is this is exhaustive. Any context where a normal length text may unfold, develop, you can assign it to one or other of these. And then you will see some further differentiation, some detailed differentiations within the 8 types. So these are the 8 types, and then further differentiation. And you could, of course, continue to explore this further. Now, one of the questions I want to be asking is, if you have this kind of global map, how can you link it up with all the detailed work that's been done, particularly within what has been called the Sydney School and the genre model there, where there's, over the last 30 years or more, been a lot of work on genres that are important in educational settings. These tend to be more detailed typologies that I want to illustrate how these can be linked up. Now, let me say something about each of these types very, very quickly. So, expanding, that is sort of building theory, theorizing what the world is like, by thinking about phenomena in general. So, either categorizing them, documenting, saying what kind of properties they have, general classes of phenomena, or explaining them, explaining why do these things happen. So general phenomena, not particular classes. And here we, of course, be concerned with building field. And this is a learning area, certainly a learning teaching area. In reporting, we're concerned with the particular. So essentially sort of reporting on the flow events. Actually chronicling flow events as in history, as in news reporting. Surveying particular places, inventorying particular entities, objects. And again, we're building field, but not generalizations about field, but the particular, sorting out the particular, okay? The flow of events, as I said. Retracing, here imaginatively, by narrating or dramatizing, we create an imaginary world, and that could in fact involve any of the other contexts. Okay? This is concerned with some higher literary theme, and we could say that expanding and recreating are similar to one another. In literature, we create some higher order theme, some sense of ideology. It may be world order in a traditional myth. It may be a sense of what should the social world be like, what is it like, what should it be like. But as it were, subliminally, this is built up through literature. And it is, in a sense, you could say theory is the analog of this, a generalization in the sort of scientific episteme in the last half millennium or so. Retracing, concerned with both world order, field, and the order of values in the social world and so on, tenor. Sharing, prototypically face-to-face communication, sharing personal experiences, personal values, sorting this out, bonding, creating rapport, empathizing, and so on. Now enabled through amazing new technologies, blurring the distinction between the private and the public. I'm thinking of things like Facebook, SMS message on mobile phones and so on, tweeting and all the rest. Doing, this would be specifically social activity, maybe aided by language. so the traditional notion of language and action. Directing people, facilitating collaboration. And this again, typically field-oriented, so you try to achieve some kind of field goals, like moving the contents of one home to another place, okay? Like undertaking surgery in an operating theatre. Recommending, this is typically recommending some course of action, promoting it or advising somebody to do something. And it tends to be tenor-oriented. It tends to sort of, especially if you promote, convince somebody to do something that they wouldn't otherwise have done, as in advertising, commercials, and so on. Okay? So it's a kind of persuasive context. Enabling, either literally enabling somebody, instructing somebody in undertaking some activity, procedure, know-how kind of situation, or protocol kind of situation, controlling that behavior, regulating that behavior. So about ability or about obligation. And this is with respect to some activities, so field-oriented, but with respect also to modality modulation, so tenor-oriented, as I said, ability and obligation. And finally then exploring, in a sense, the public version of sharing, where you're concerned with public values, public stances, hypotheses, ideas and so on, and you're giving value to them, or you're trying to convince somebody of shifting a position, comparing and contrasting positions and saying this is why I would argue that you should believe in this one or you should go with this one rather than that one. So again, very much tenor-oriented and persuasive. So let me just give two examples. One from expounding, giving a bit of sense of field-oriented, and one from tenor, giving a bit of sense of tenor orientation. So from expounding, this is an extract from a university-level textbook in geology, a chapter on rock classification. And I've used tools from Brigham Young University, Dr. Davis, made available where you can color code according to frequency. So what stands out are the less frequent items, but they often tell us something about the context and the text in its context. Let me expand this a little bit, and I think you can see it. Okay. So, if you look at the yellow, these are less frequent items, but they're also then more characteristic of this particular register, this particular text type. And you see what stands out are things like classification, igneous, formation, sedimentary, classified, marine, lacustrine, deposited, glacial, fragments, composed, mechanical, clastic, classification, subdivided, and so on. I think it doesn't take long until you pick up on the fact that this is a text building field. You can even see what kind of field it is. And this is part of the challenge. So a lot of technical scientific terminology, taxonomized and so on. So you get a sense of field orientation very quickly and very strongly. Let me take another example of the text. It's again the same principle. So color coding according to frequency in the text, and the less frequent ones in a range from in a range of text that totally excludes grammatical items, function words, and only less frequent lexical items, lexemes. Let me say, I should have said this comes from COCO, the American Corpus of Contemporary English. Okay, so that's a way of judging the frequency, but it's a useful tool. Let me take a dramatically different kind of text from the exploring sector, where the orientation is not towards field, but towards tenor. So not towards building field, but towards exploring values. Okay. And this comes from an opinion piece called Lighting the Fuse by the American writer and you can say activist Peter Matthiessen before the attack on Iraq in the early noughts. So sort of lighting the fuse. Okay. And subtitle is Freeing the Iraqi People to Death. Sadly, it turns out to be prescient, but a bit before the attack has started. Now, again, let me magnify a little bit. Okay. And I think you can see very clearly what stands out. So the less frequent items have a very different flavor. Okay. Inevitable slaughter, endangered, sole offense, courtesy, painfully intensified, shrieking, maimed, prey, strategic cluster, armadas, rockets, terrify, essentially defenseless, mortality, terrible, massacre, heroes, decorated, shame, near bluff tactics, obliteration, anxious, protest marches, Holocaust, slaughter. Of course, they also have field content, they're also aviation, but there is a lot of charge in terms of interpersonal loading, right? And the point is, if you're using appraisal, description kind of analysis, then this would be picked up very strongly as it is in exploring text. So a very different orientation and very different kinds of meanings at risk in this sector. You could do the same for texts that are multisemiotic. So here's an example of an expanding text that Marvin Lam and I worked on, talking to teachers in the Philippines, so giving an intensive set of workshop to teachers in the Philippines. It's a Filipino textbook, and it's an expanding text about the atmosphere, and you see a very, very schematic drawing with the different layers of the atmosphere indexed in the text. Doesn't look like anything like a photorealistic representation of the atmosphere, but it's a schematic representation of the composition of the atmosphere. And highly schematic drawings of this kind are typical in the expanding sector. Then we contrast that with the kind of drawing you get in the exploring sector, where you're not concerned with building field, but with sort of debating values, exploring values. And contrast is often very important. So you see on the left, you have Wall Street and then Baylard hanging. And on the right, you have Main Street and a noose. Okay. So setting up this kind of contrast, a very, very different way in which pictorial imagic systems work in the exploring sector. Now, let me come back then to the typology and say a few more things about it. So this color coding, as before, it represents the different segments: expanding, reporting, recreating, sharing, doing, recommending, and enabling. Okay. Now, we've come to call this a discursive pie of fortune. Fortune because it looks like a wheel of fortune, but it's more like a pie. And since it's a pie, you can take out segments, of course. Here, what I've taken out is a segment that's concerned with context in which essentially constituted in social interactive behavior, and language only comes in to facilitate or gesture other semiotic systems. So context of this type. All the others are essentially constituted in language or other semiotic systems. So that's an important difference. But then we can take out two other segments, enabling and recommending, because they often lead to doing. Okay? So enable, regulate, make you willing to undertake something in a doing context. So in this way, we can recognize that there are distinctions within the different sectors. And we could add a consideration looking at this briefly from the point of view of mode. Mode is concerned with the role of language, other semiotic systems in context in green here. So a doing context is one where the essential work is done by processes in the social system. Okay. So social process constitutive, language, other semiotic systems only come in to facilitate, as in surgery and operating theatre, as in moving heavy furniture around. Okay. The others then, with the language or some other semiotic system as constitutive. Now, give you a little bit of sense of this holistic map, and let me now take a second step and try to illustrate how this links up to all the very detailed work on genres in educational context by our colleagues who've come to be known as people in the Sydney School, but also other people around the world. Now, the work over the decades is summarized in a fairly recent book by Jim Martin, who was kind of leader in the development of the Sydney School, and David Rose from 2008, a book called Genre Relations Mapping Culture. And if you look at the table of contents, the sort of major chapters are stories, narratives, anecdotes, example of observation, histories, including biographical recounts, historical accounts, historical explanations, historical expositions, discussions and challenges, reports and explanations, and procedures and procedural recounts. You get a true to false summary of this from an ontogenetic point of view. This, I don't mean the particular framework, but I mean the experience of sort of growing one's own personal repertoire of genres or registers in a book that appeared in the same year by Frank Christie and Ed Derenka, School Discourse, with a review of all the research that's been done, and then also a report on a major research project of their own, looking at written material, textbooks and so on, and also looking at written output by students. And again, concerned with a selection of subjects, including English, history, sort of science, physics and so on, natural world, concerned with expanding, exploring and so on. Now, let me link up the kind of taxonomy that developed within the genre model and show you locations within our discursive Pi-fortune. This kind of typology was already available by the mid-1980s and reported in by J. Martin in a book called Factual Writing, which has played a significant role in the educational context. So these lines show where the locations would be within the context shown by the discursive Pi-fortune. Let me magnify and then illustrate. Okay? So expounding, that corresponds to two categories of document and explaining. So these are things concerned with building field about general classes of phenomena. And then you can begin to use the work on more detailed forms of report, documentation, descriptive report, taxonomic report, composition reports, the inventories expandments of the mid-80s, under what we've called categorizing, expanding by categorizing. And then explaining different forms of explanation, sequential explanation, causal explanation, theoretical explanation, factorial explanation, consequential explanation. The one thing that doesn't quite belong there is exploring. You see, it corresponds fairly clearly to the expounding sector. And then exposition, discussion, to the exploring sector. So you see this discursive Pi-fortune imposes another kind of order. But if you look back on the total figure, you see there are a number of sectors that are not illustrated or only very partially illustrated. And that was one reason why a number of us started in on this project a long time ago, in particular Kazuhiro Teruya and myself, drawing on work by Jinio, because we needed something that was comprehensive. We needed this for many contexts, educational course, but also language description, reasoning about translation, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, you can slot in all the fantastic rich work on genre, but then you'll find that there are other areas that haven't been covered, or there are areas that are covered not so much in the educational context, but say friends and the workplace, Eggins and Slade, casual conversation. A lot of this will be in the sharing sector. Let me give you now a couple of examples. So expounding, categorizing. This is a taxonomic report in a Hong Kong chemistry textbook, a concept map. So a kind of multi-semiotic display. You see here in the middle fossil fuels, and then there are arrows indicated a taxonomy. Let me expand it a little bit. So it says fossil fuels contain hydrocarbons, consist of hydrogen and carbon. Okay? And fossil fuels need to taxonomy: petroleum, natural gas, coal, petroleum refined by fractional distillation, and so on. So typical, as I said, highly schematic. You have to learn to read concept maps of this kind. I mean, there are different conventions, but it's essentially categorizing. Okay. This is from the teacher's book, actually. So some categories that the students have to fill in are there, so you have the answer. Okay. So that's an example of a multi-semiotic categorizing text. Let me now give you an expanding, explaining text. So this is a sequential explanation in a Hong Kong chemistry textbook, the refining process. So about 2 pages of the refining process. You see the title there, photo, diagram, and diagram with some photos included. Let me again magnify it a little bit. So you see the refining process. It says in an oil refinery, petroleum is first heated in a furnace to about 400 degrees Celsius. The hot oil, now partly liquid and partly vapor, is pumped into the bottom of a tall tower called the fractioning tower, figure 30.14. The liquid part, the residue, falls to the bottom. The vapor part rises to the tower. Figure 30.15 illustrates the refining process. So you can see this is explaining what the refining process is like, and it's a sequential explanation. So among the explanations, this is the one that's closest to a historical recount, but it's about refining in general, not what happened to Fido, the mass of oil that was refined on the 14th of September 1925, this kind of thing, right? So it's a general process explaining how the refinement comes about by setting up the sequence, and it's multisemiotic. So, you know, oil refining petroleum is first heated, and there are a number of signals that indicate the temporal sequence. You have a second, throw over to a second page, okay, and this says, as the vapors rise up the tower, they cool and condense to liquid. Heavier and higher boiling fractions condense at lower, hotter levels. Lighter and lower boiling fractions condense at higher, cooler levels. Hydrocarbons with the lowest boiling points rise to the top of the tower and come out as gases. There are bubble caps, figure 30.16, in each level of the tower. They make the separation of fractions more effective, and that's the end of the sequential explanation. So, if you want to locate this in our discursive high fortune, this is where we locate it. So, expounding, explaining, sorry, this is not factorial explanation, it's a sequential explanation. But I give you an example of another kind of explanation, which is factorial. Okay? And at just one point further that I want to illustrate that the elements of the generic structure that scholars, researchers posit for different genres, like sequential explanation, like factorial explanation, part of our research program is to say in much more detail how these realized strategically. So how they turned into organization of text as a flow of meanings, a unit of meanings, when you move into the semantics. And the answer is we can represent them using rhetorical structure theory as rhetorical complexes. Let me illustrate this very schematically for a factorial explanation. Okay. So generic element phenomenon identification, and that's a nuclear segment of the text, and then factors. That's an elaboration of the nuclear segments, essentially an additive sequence of factors, in this case explaining physical weathering. Okay. So if you're concerned with physical weathering, it says this process is the cause of the breaking up of large rocks into smaller pieces. Physical process can cause changes in rocks. Okay. So that's, if you don't remember anything else from this text, this is what you should remember. But the whole rest of the body of the text is an elaboration of this generalization. And this is where the factors come in, the factors that may be involved in causing physical weathering. Okay. So that's a kind of display. But back to our example of the multisemiotic text. Okay. So let me represent it in the same way, and let me represent it as an analysis of as a text, as a rhetorical complex, but also including the diagrams, photos, illustrations, and so on, linked into the text. Because the cross-referencing doesn't work. Okay? The cross-referencing sort of anchors these diagrams or photographs in the text we're familiar with. Now, as I said, this is a sequential explanation. So, most centrally, you can say the text is simply a temporal sequence. Okay? So, in an oil refinery, petroleum is first heated in a furnace, etc. Right? The hot oil is pumped into the bottom of a tall tower called the fractioning tower. Okay? The liquid, the residue, falls to the bottom with the liquid part. The vapor part rises up the tower, and then as the vapor rises up the tower, they cool and condense to liquid. And that's a sort of, in a sense, the nuclear temporal sequence explaining the refining process. Okay? Now, then there are some further details. One is, of course, that this whole sequence, okay, set up in the text itself, the linguistic text, figure 3.5, illustrate the refining process. So there is an elaboration, a kind of restatement of the text diagrammatically. And language does the part, figure 3.5, and the elaboration then is this sequential explanatory diagram of the refining process. Okay. There is also detail, so and condensed to liquid, and then that is elaborated, saying what happens to the condensed liquids in different parts of this refining tower. Heavier and higher boiling fractions condense at lower, hotter levels. Lighter and lower boiling fractions condense at higher, cooler levels. Hydrocarbons with the lowest boiling points rise to the top of the tower and come out as gases, so a little bit of a sequence. But this is simply adding details about what happens to the liquid. Okay? And then there is an elaboration talking about the bubble caps. They make the separation fractions more effective. That's true at any of the levels. And then there is a photograph of the bubble caps, so sort of showing how this is linked in. And as I said, the same was true of the whole diagram. Now, one challenge then in expounding text of this kind is it appears on the page, of course, as a collage. In this particular example, I think it's fairly coherent. There is a fair bit of help. But of course, it's part of learning to process, learning to build knowledge in context of this kind, that you have to have a sense. You have to be able to know what are the strategies for linking things and how they complement one another. Now, this is just one illustration. There's been a lot of work on mapping school subjects. And let me just mention a few of these and then begin to sort of the final phase of the discussion. So, in fact, the example I took was from chemistry. In our group, the person who's really worked on chemistry is Jack Poole. Okay? And here he is at one of the other language and education symposia talking about chemistry from the point of view of the context that are represented in chemistry textbook materials. And so the central question you asked was, what are the complementarities? What is the makeup of chemistry in secondary school? So from a semiotic point of view, from the point of view of the textbook material, what constitutes chemistry? And so he worked very hard on this. He wrote an MA thesis on it. And let me give you a simplified version first. So if you take the chemistry textbook that I've worked on, taking examples from chemistry, the modern view. So you'd be happy to know in chemistry it's still modern. It's not yet postmodern. Okay. I don't know what postmodern chemistry would be like. Now, the point is, this is a complex macrotext. And the chemistry textbook does various things. But very centrally, of course, it expands chemical knowledge, theorizing about chemistry, okay, the chemical world. And that's again the sequential explanation I gave you. Okay. So what's one major context for text in the chemistry book? Okay. But there are other contexts as well. So for example, you have enabling context, setting up a lab experiment. Outside the textbook, you actually do the lab experiment. That's not in the textbook, so I haven't shown it. But once you've done the lab experiment, then you learn how to record and chronicle it. So a lab report, the report on the lab experiment, what you learned outside the textbook in doing the text. So that kind of sector is represented. And sort of advice, warnings about working in the lab. So also recommending sector. Now Jack's own background was very interesting. He says he was the product of the Hong Kong science education system. So I think for us, a wonderful and fairly unique experience in how we can explore the, how this works in secondary school. And in secondary school, he worked through Chinese, with CMI, and then he moved to tertiary school, PolyU. He continued with chemistry, but now, of course, he had to switch from Chinese to English. And as I said, he had to relearn chemistry in English. And there was not much help. Not much help. Okay. A lot more could have been done, he feels. So then he studied PolyU, and we were so lucky. Somehow he discovered you could do a minor in English, He did a minor in English with us, and the rest, as I say, is history. At least so far is history. In other words, he found actually linguistics is even more interesting than chemistry. And linguistics can explain to me why I found it difficult, what the challenges were. I wanted to understand it, so he wanted to understand the kind of experience students like him would have, but then he also wanted to get the resources to intervene, to help with materials, with the bridge from secondary to tertiary, etc. Okay. So, from chemistry to linguistics. Now, I think we have to treasure people like these sort of bi-disciplinary people. I think that kind of expertise is very, very valuable. So, as I said, in his research, he built up a map of sort of the textbook and the complementary components of chemistry. And you see there's more detail than I've given you before, but that's the kind of insight it gave us into chemistry, what constitutes chemistry. So what does it mean to do chemistry in secondary school from the point of view of the textbook? And he connected the two, showed how they were connected. One thing we had in my chemistry, now I'm going back decades and decades to the last millennium. So this is from my chemistry book. Still have it compared with Jack's material. And one thing we certainly had were also sort of from the recounting sector, little bio-blurbs. Okay? So little biographical recounts of important people who have been important in chemistry, like Einstein and Mendel with the periodic table and so on. Okay? So that's from the recounting sector. So you can get a sense of this. Now, again, in relation to the discursive higher fortune, we can say, well, what does doing chemistry mean? And I'm very well aware of that. We want to continue to sort of see what's the environment of the textbook, what happens in the classroom, what happens outside the classroom, what's the totality of the engagement with chemistry. But this is a sort of map based on the textbook. Well, we can see, and I think this relates very clearly to what you learned from Christie and Derenka 2008, the sort of build-up of context of texts in different disciplines. So, chemistry, I think, most centrally it involved constructional theory, chemical theory. So in some sense, this is what I would call the discursive or registerial center of gravity in chemistry. In some sense, the other sectors are there to support this process. But very essentially, then you have learning experiment, so preparing for chemical experiments. And as I said, outside the textbook, experimenting, so carrying out the experiments, observing, learning to observe. Okay? And that's, of course, where you get a sense of a chemical fact. So, in principle, then the complementarity between lab and textbook should give you a sense of the connection between chemical fact that you can observe, record, and chemical theory. And then you learn to record this in the reporting sector kind of context, right? Recording, chronicling the lab experiment, drawing conclusions. And that, in principle, will support the generalizations that take you into the expounding sector, theorizing what the world of chemistry is like. Now, very interestingly, Jack also looked at the different text types, and you can see that it's justified saying that expounding is the registerial center of gravity, because 64% of the texts in the chemistry book were in fact explanations. And 6% procedure, so enabling sector, 13% procedural recount, so expounding sector, and a little bit of exploration, and then reports, again, reporting sector, expanding sector, and expositions, discussions. So one thing I left out from this that would be foregrounded, I think, more, and you're apprenticed into chemistry in tertiary school, and in particular, as you move towards higher level undergraduate and into postgraduate, you learn to argue. So you learn to assign value to different chemical hypotheses, theories, to argue about preferences. You learn to say who said what and why you should believe somebody else, and so on and so forth, right? So that's there a little bit in the chemical textbook, but it's not very dominant. Now, let me say a little bit about one or two other things, but this will be much briefer because they will be represented through the day. We have interesting project concerned with English as a foreign language teacher. Okay? And these are two key people. You have them around here, Winfred Lee and Nancy Gore. You're back from Sydney. Yes, there you are, back from Sydney. So complementary projects illuminating the issues in English foreign language learning teaching. Winfred is working on a longitudinal study of EFL writing categorized in terms of this discursive power fortune. This is a sort of different representation. As Jack experienced, it's very good to have terminology in two languages. Squeeze Winfred and he will help you with terms in Chinese. So he's translated all the terms into Chinese of the discursive power fortune. So this is another representation of it. And all the annotation here, these are terms in Chinese. So longitudinal study of student writing, seeing what sectors and what's the systematicity in sectors, is there a sense of progression, issues that you can ask if you have a map. Nancy is complementary, so looking at successive years of EFL textbooks in Hong Kong and the mainland. And one component, again, is registerial cartography. So seeing what texts are introduced in what level of textbooks, how do they progress through year 1, year 2, year 3, and so on. Is there a shift in focus emphasis? Is there a sense of building on the earlier years? How systematic is the selection and so on? So that's another example. Now, let me just, sort of by way of winding up, say something about, if you compare different secondary school subjects, English, science, history, kind of comparison you can do thanks largely to Christine Derianka's school discourse, all the research they surveyed, then you get a very interesting picture. And one thing we're keen to do, of course, is to replicate this in Hong Kong, in the Pearl River Delta, across the border, but also to look at it at tertiary level and to get a much more detailed, much more evidence-based sense of what are the challenges if you move from secondary school to tertiary school. What are the continuities? Are you helped with the continuities? Are there correlations across school subject in secondary school? Are there correlations across disciplines in tertiary school? In other words, if you're learning one kind of processing of knowledge in one kind of context, in one subject or one discipline, is this in some way supported, linked to what's going on in another discipline? So that's an issue for sort of wholesale curricular development. Now, again, the same sectors, expanding, reporting, recreating, and so on, and just a few concentric circles. So the innermost, this is history, and that's showing the points at which you will experience, or the major experience with written text in history in the Australian school system. Okay? And if you follow the work by Karen Coffin, Bev Duranka, and Frank Christie, a very, very fascinating account of this. And with history, there is a fairly linear move. So coming in from the experience with dealing with time in narratives, from fiction, then into fact, learning to recount, learning to control settings in time, and then in the earlier stages, students move through the reporting sector. Towards the end of this, they add pause to time with historical accounts, so from historical recounts to historical accounts. Then they drop time in a sense, and they began to generalize about history, historical explanations, so why do revolutions happen, this kind of thing. So into the expanding sector, and then mid to late secondary school, they change the sense of cause from why do things happen to why should you believe my account or somebody's account, which is the preferred account, so into the exploring sector. So from external cause in the world of experience to internal cause in arguing and so on. And the very end would be meta-history, historiography. Okay? Now, you can compare this with other subjects. English, you say English almost entirely focused on the exploring sector. Okay? Reviewing, this kind of thing, arguing, literary criticism, this kind of thing. You can compare that with science as it's been explored in Australia, and chemistry, as Jack did here, fairly similar between the two. And you see here the centre of gravity is in the expanding sector, but some of the other sectors are also important. So it's building up this kind of thing and looking at it over time and one person who's drawn attention to this is in a talk as part of a symposium we had at the ICC in Lisbon last year, John Polius. He's talking about the different branches and registers, and then he's talking about lessons. So sort of giving a sense of how this is ordered over time and how they link to one another. So in conclusion, I'm just trying to illustrate the notion of using a register map. And as I said, this is commissioned work. Some of this I think you've heard me talk about before, or colleagues of mine. But I wanted to do two things. I wanted to link it to the genre work, and showing by linking to the genre work how you can locate those descriptions on a more holistic map, how you can reason holistically about the complementarity among different subjects and hopefully university disciplines, but also how you can then look at it longitudinally and getting a sense how things develop over time, if they build on one another, if there are resonances in other subjects or other disciplines, where one might be able to move in, help, and so on. But also then the question of going beyond identifying the elements of a generic structure, kind of thing that Ricard Sand has done for the nursery tale as a genre placement, sort of saying, well, we can then also become more specific, building an account of the strategic semantics you need to be able to construct a sequential explanation, sequencing in time, generalized over time, so habitual generic present as it's called, versus a vectorial explanation where you need to be able to sort out atemporally, as it were, the nucleus of what's to be explained, and then elaborate with factors and simply add up the factors atemporally, acausally, and so on. Many other examples. If you want to work with modality, then the enabling sector is very good, regulating, obligation, and so on. If you're very interested in the personal, I already demonstrated, exploring is good because you do a lot with evaluation. Same is true of recommending, building value for a product and process, and so on. So, as I said, this is the warm-up band, and I hope we'll all have a fantastic symposium. Many thanks for coming. And maybe the fog will lift, so we'll have more blue sky. But have a wonderful day, and we're very, very happy to have you all here. We feel this is now a kind of like family reunions. So many thanks for coming. Thank you.